Geographically, Russia, as you see up north, big country, but however, if you can also take a look, it has a small little connection to North Korea by land, even though China is its primary neighbor due to the Yalu River, and also understanding how close Russia is to Japan in terms of, while Russia is continuing its unjust invasion over in Europe, its reach is also extended into East Asia as well. Next slide. All right. And as I mentioned, trying to go over a history of Russian and Korean relations because, again, ancient times, Soviet times, and modern times, they are all relevant to what's going on. Next slide. All right. Just a recap for those of you who don't know that much about Korea. So for those of you who already know, please consider this a refresher. Ancient times. That's a whole subject in and of itself. But just to quickly sum it up, from BC times until the 900s, there were multiple small kingdoms. Sometimes they collaborated against each other. Sometimes they fought against each other. The caveat is, again, there was, even that small peninsula, there were still multiple sides. The first major unification was in 918 because the name Korea, it comes from the original term Goryeo, based upon that initial unification. The final dynasty, Joseon, took place from the 1390s all the way to the 1910s, over 500 years. And while many people think that Hermit Kingdom just applies to North Korea, it actually goes way back. The original source of that nickname came from an 1882 book by William Elliot Griffiths. He was a Christian missionary and an Asian enthusiast, and he coined that nickname because even during ancient times, Korea in and of itself was very isolationist because it was surrounded by multiple powerful countries and tried to focus inward. Its last incarnation is the Korean Empire, like mentioned in the bullet point, 1897 to 1910. Until 1895, it was actually a protectorate under Imperial China, and it got out from under there due to China losing its war with Japan. And the borders are mostly similar to today because, as you can see from that picture, it's combined, and while there's a small little area over into China itself, China and Korea have had relations going back centuries. And just to understand as well, the reason why we have a divided Korea today, even before World War II, even before the Cold War, we also had the Russo-Japanese War and its initial colonization by Japan. Next slide. Now, the Russo-Japanese War from 1904 to 1905. Understanding the players at the time, it was Tsarist-era Russia versus Imperial Japan. Again, at the time, both of them were still ruled by absolute monarchs, and at the time, along with them, there were multiple other countries that were trying to compete for expanding either their colonial reach or for having imperial interests for the sake of dominating the economies. The sphere of influence arguments, just to elaborate further about the two. First one, Japan, they've been wanting Korea, not just back then, but going back centuries. They proposed to Russia, and they were allied with the UK at the time, give up Korea, and we'll leave Manchurian area China alone. You can have that. Russia turned it down because of a few different reasons. One, occupation. They had previously sent in their troops. For them, it was a matter of blood already spilled. Second, previous investments. Russia had started building some infrastructure, some railways over in the area, and when expanding, they did not want to lose the money that they had gotten. And finally, goading by Germany. At the time, Germany had the Kaiser, and a little bit of racism involved. The Kaiser actually told the Russian Tsar, "You're a white savior. Do you really want to let this small little yellow emperor push you around and talk trash to you?" As a result, talks broke down and there was war. To elaborate further about that bullet point about the Japanese victory, number one, surprise. While many of us in America remember Pearl Harbor and about Japan conducting a surprise attack over at the naval fleet in Hawaii, back then, Japan launched a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor over in Manchurian area China, and they greatly damaged the Russian Pacific Fleet, even with a lot of built-up fortifications and infrastructure over there. So it was rendered inoperable during the war. Modernization. Russia, unfortunately, was still operating under some older tactics. The Crimean War, which had happened about 50 years earlier, they were still operating under that organization, using some of those systems, even some of that old technology. Japan was going through what's called the Meiji Restoration. For any of you who remember a movie back in the 2000s, The Last Samurai with Tom Cruise, that was based off of real-life history because the U.S. Admiral Perry forced Japan to open its doors, and after Japan saw that it was grossly outclassed and outmatched, they started importing Western technology, Western culture, and they started drastically updating their military. And last but not least, logistics. Russia, by landmass, is a bigger country. However, when it comes down to like roads and railroads, it still takes a long while in order to move troops, weapons, equipment, and supplies from point A to point B, which meant they had a longer time period in order to move a lot of that equipment. And furthermore, they actually moved their Atlantic fleet over in the west near Europe. They had to circumvent and go all the way around in order to support that war, which unfortunately took too long while Japan was far more nimble. As a result, Japan won, and first and foremost, forfeiture of some Asian interests. Russia had to give up some of the investments they had made as a conquering colonial power. Second, it damaged their credibility. Instead of being this European dog on the block that was taking over parts of Asia to expand their empire, they started looking weak in the eyes of other conquering nations. And last but not least, the revolution of 1905. The Russian Tsar still remained in power until 1917, but he was forced to establish a state Duma, and there were still efforts made in order to reduce his power, even though he was still desperately trying to hold on to it. And as for Korea, Japan forced Korea to sign an unfair treaty in 1905, and that set off a chain of events for the full takeover later on. Next slide. Japanese occupation, 1910 to 1945. Understanding that it was full occupation, it was just pure out pillaging. For Japanification, they were forcing Koreans to learn Japanese culture and Japanese ways. Koreans were second-class citizens in their own former country, and a lot of resources in Korea, a lot of crops, a lot of other minerals or other things were being extracted and taken for Japanese use. And World War II, it was not only a world war, it was also the war of liberation for Korea. But even during that time period, it was still rough. Korean men, they were involuntarily drafted and forced to fight for Japan against the Allies. Korean women, if you can look it up, if you don't want to look it up on Google, comfort women. A lot of Korean women were forced into prostitution and had to provide sexual services for the Japanese military. But it's also an important note that there were also anti-Japanese Korean guerrillas that were also fighting during this time period. And with partial similarity to the division of East and West Germany, Korea was divided, the 30th parallel, due to the discussions between the Soviet Union and China and the Allied powers during this time. North of the 30th parallel was the Soviet Union's territory. To the south was the US territory. Next slide. Now, for the Korean War itself, it lasted from 1950 to 1953. And while it's a little more obscure here in the US, for those of you who remember an old movie and television show, MASH, that movie and TV show talked about life at an army hospital in Korea during that time. And while we're using the terms North and South Korea, the formal names are the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, the TPRK, for the North, and also for South Korea, it's the Republic of Korea, ROK. It's also important to note that it's still considered a civil war because they've been liberated from Japan, even though there were two sides operating and attempting to work together, but unfortunately it didn't work out. Just for clarity and as a rehash, North Korea was communist. It started the war. South Korea To clarify, it was anti-communist, but similar to the Republic of China in Taiwan during this time during the Cold War, it was not free, it was a dictatorship. And also, it's important to note the support from outside nations. North Korea started the war. The Soviet Union gave it its blessing and provided materiel support, weapons and equipment. And China later on provided troops for the West, understanding as well. Even though the US did a lot of the heavy lifting, there were other Western countries that did participate and support South Korea during this time. And I'm just going to stand up for a minute just to illustrate to you. North Korea, they initially pushed down south in South Korea. Then South Korea, thanks to Western help, they had a counteroffensive which pushed back up towards the Yalu River. China then got involved because it got close to their border, and that's where they get stuck at that armistice line near where they started at the 38th parallel. The polar point on my slide about it ending with a ceasefire instead of a formal peace treaty. Just to rehash for the sake of politics, a ceasefire is considered similar to a sports timeout. It's a pause in fighting. It does not mean that the war itself is over. And North Korea has actually wanted a peace treaty, not because that they want peace itself, but that it gives them official recognition because they still suffer from a lack of formal diplomatic status. And finally, just to recap, that division today continues with the DMZ because you see on the armistice line, that armistice line is heavily fortified. Landmines, barbed wire, guard towers to enforce the notion of a hard border. Panmunjom, that is the place which straddles both North and South Korea, in which talks and observation continue to take place to this day. Next slide. I also want to emphasize as well something that's often forgotten about. While North Korea is poor today, it was actually richer during the Cold War. From the 50s to the 60s, it was richer than South Korea. If you look at the pictures on the slide, I got that from Daily Mail, a British newspaper. They had amusement parks, gourmet restaurants, shopping. North Korea actually was living in a relatively good status compared to the South for the first 20 years after the war, and was still evenly competitive up through the 70s. The term sugar daddy diplomacy came from a YouTuber called Untold by Tony, in which he described how North Korea manipulated both the USSR and the PRC for aid. Just to elaborate further onto the bullet points. For Pyongyang, China provided help with two things. One, they forgave a lot of loans to North Korea, which helped them out. They also sent in engineers, which helped North Korea develop its public transit system for the capital. And the second bullet, for heavily subsidized prices. Chemical fertilizers, oil, weaponry. The Soviet Union was selling them at below market prices. They were either selling them at break even or even taking a loss because at the time, based on ideology, based on the belief that North Korea was a staunch ally, a lot of other resources which were only expensive, especially for a country rebuilding from war, it was cheap and plentiful for them. Free housing and healthcare during that time period based upon its communist ideology and the fact that they were able to rebuild. Many citizens, not just the elite, had homes and had their medical taken care of. And also, from the 1970s, Nordic nations, Norway, Sweden, and Finland and others, they were trading with North Korea based upon the idea that they thought they could set up a future relationship down the road if the bipolarity of the time ever changed. Next slide. But however, as many of us already know, North Korea, its good times would not last. What led to its downfall? First, Gorbachev. During the 1980s, because he had his glasnost of perestroika philosophies, he started reducing aid to North Korea because he started seeing them more as a liability and a drain rather than being an asset. And not to mention, South Korea was groaning in nature, and the 1988 Olympics in Seoul was like a crowning achievement at the time. For Gorbachev, it was more of, why continue to throw money and give discounts to North Korea when I can get a better return by working with the South. And after the USSR fell, the aid previously stopped. It stopped. And the problem was, even with trade with the Russian Federation, it was nowhere near the level as it was during the Cold War. And to elaborate further about those later losses after earlier gains, severe damage to land from the unsustainable practices, two come to mind. Number one, Korean ranchers would often have their goats forage and eat some plants that were on a lot of hillsides. The problem was some of those plants were stabilizers for those hills, and with those plants gone, instead of having like a mild to moderate landslide that you might have after a rainstorm, let's say in the US state of Oregon or California on the West Coast, those landslides became catastrophic based upon that practice. Second, I mentioned on the earlier slide about chemical fertilizers. Chemical fertilizers are similar to performance-enhancing drugs. Truthfully, we have to be honest. Athletes in both West and East take them, but however, if you take them for too long or for too much or become too over-dependent, they can cause long-term damage to the body. Because North Korea had become over-dependent on having cheap chemical fertilizers and then suddenly getting cut off, their crop yields went from being relatively prosperous down to becoming very meager. And Nordic nations, they stopped trade because while North Korea started trading with them initially, Nordic nations started realizing how bad it was. North Korean diplomats would often try to smuggle out goods because a lot of luxury goods like tobacco, alcohol, perfumes, or other things, you don't only have to pay a duty on them, you don't only have to pay taxes on them. The diplomats would use their efforts in order to smuggle them out, resell them illegally through North Korean channels, which greatly angered the Nordic nations. And another great example is the Swedish automaker Volvo. They sold 1,000 cars to North Korea, which are still in use today as taxis. To this day, North Korea has yet to pay the bill. Sweden still continues to send them a bill with interest, asking North Korea, are you ever going to pay us back for those cars from decades ago? And last but not least, Western sanctions continued. To clarify, sanctions in and of themselves do not bankrupt a country, but they do serve as a hard limit. They do serve as a land or sea mine in order to disrupt an economic route. Because of the sanctions, North Korea has still continued to rely on smuggling to support its economy, and these sanctions continue to this day because of hostile acts, because since its inception, a lot of hostile acts. North Korea has kidnapped Japanese civilians. They did dig tunnels into South Korea in a failed attempt for a covert invasion, and they also bombed a South Korean airliner during the 1980s as a show of force. And again, it's rough, but however, the sanctions exist because of what they do. And also, just to clarify some of the philosophies, North Korea has operated under the philosophy of Ju-she, self-reliance, even though they hypocritically take a lot of aid from others, whether it be the Soviet Union, China, or just even trade with Nordic nations from the previous times. Their current philosophy has been Songun, military first. Even though the US military is the most well-funded just overall by total, but proportionally by GDP, North Korea actually funds its military even more. And compared to other militaries like South Korea, Taiwan, Israel, and others, North Korea drafts both men and women. Their terms are far longer. It can be over a decade in the North Korean military versus just 2 or 3 years in other countries. And they're heavily reliant on the military to perform farming or a lot of civil work because they are short on people and they just need organizations that can be able to handle all that. And for the poverty, North Korea elite, they live in luxury. A lot of them still get access to Western goods. And some of their people secretly go to Swiss boarding schools and so forth. But however, the peasants, they are far shorter than their South Korean counterparts, And some of them, as you see in the picture, are forced to rely on side hustles in order to stay afloat because of their poverty and because of all these practices which hurt North Korean agriculture and the trade from previous times. Next slide. Now, to go into the Kim family, understanding that one big difference between North Korea and East Germany, it's not just having a regime that's loyal to the Soviet Union. They've had a family dynasty going back since the very beginning. Kim Il-sung from 1912 to 1994. Just to recap on the slides, bullets, he was an anti-Japanese insurgent before becoming the founder of North Korea. He initially started with the Chinese communists, but ended up leaving them because of just being a mismatch. He had dropped out of their military academy for just cultural misfits, and also was having trouble getting himself promoted and being able to advance himself. He later switched to the Soviet Union during World War II, and was actually an officer in their equivalent of a foreign legion at the time. And what I mean by leadership under a personality cult, along with that picture of him and Stalin, here in the U.S., we have some of the tall tales. For example, we have John Henry, the railroad digger. We have Paul Bunyan and his ox Babe as that mythical lumberjack. There are some tall tales about Kim Il-sung. For example, in one dire situation, he was able to turn sand into rice. In another dire situation, he was able to turn a pine cone into a grenade. And some of those tall tales still get tossed around in North Korean society today. His son, Kim Jong-il. I'm using the term 1941 and 1942 because of two reasons. One, there are conflicting records about when he was actually born, and also in some Asian countries, here in the US, we normally track birth and age by at year zero. For example, an infant who's at 6 months or a toddler and so forth. In some Asian countries, they start at year 1. So again, based on that, it could be either one of those years. And that mythology continues. The myth about Kim Jong-il, he was born in an insurgent camp in occupied Korea, and at the time of his birth, there was a rainbow that appeared that showed a sign of prosperity. In reality, he was more likely born in a Soviet military hospital in Siberia based upon connections that Daddy had with the USSR. And lastly, Kim Jong-un. Again, conflicting dates because there are different reports that say his birth date was this year or that year. We don't know. Being the most ruthless among the Kim brothers, North Korea is a very patriarchal society, and even though women are involved as advisors or as support, they're not going to be accepted as a leader. And also, for them being the most ruthless, just to go back on that, one of his other brothers was considered too soft and was disqualified for consideration. Another one of his brothers, Kim Jong-nam, he actually got caught trying to sneak into Disneyland in Japan with a forged passport, which caused great embarrassment from the North Korean perspective. And later on, Kim Jong-un had his brother assassinated in Singapore. And it's not just his brothers. Jang Song-thak, whose name I might be mispronouncing, but it was his uncle. He had him executed as well, not just by firing squad, but by air defense gun. That shows you the level of ruthlessness. And just to recap, Kim Il-sung, extremely warm ties during Stalin's time. Kim Jong-il, they were lukewarm because during the 2000s, the Soviet Union, Russia, they actually tried to work with the U.S. in order to try to talk North Korea into disarming unsuccessfully. However, in modern times, they are far stronger today than they have been. Next slide. Now, to discuss the impacts from the Russian invasion. Next slide. Diplomatic support. Way back in 2014, when Russia seized Crimea, much of the world was in outrage. However, North Korea formally recognized it as an official part of Russia. As you see in that picture between Kim Jong-un, Xi Jinping, and Putin, Their relations are far warmer today than they have been in previous times. And in 2024, during the invasion, they actually signed a formal treaty in order to cement the relationship even further. And for economic support, tourism. Tourism has existed in North Korea for a while, but it's been very small just because of a lot of North Korean fears about embarrassment or about security concerns, because they're trying to, again, promote to their people and to the outside world of how self-sufficient they are, even though they're poor. Russia, they've got access now, and from what I can tell, they've been able to go to North Korea with far fewer restrictions compared to you or I, in which, as Americans, we could go, but there would be a lot of administrative paperwork and hoop jumping, and a lot greater risk of being incarcerated based upon the strictness of that society. Updated technology and oil. North Korea now has resources. While they're still poor, they've drastically improved their living conditions because Russia has provided an additional smuggling channel for them. And their GDP, it's drastically grown thanks to Russia improving its ties with them. Next slide. Now for the military support. To clarify, even though they deployed troops a little while ago, this support actually has gone on since 2022, since the invasion began. It was subtle at first, it was small, but it's been growing drastically. Like mentioned, artillery munitions and missiles. When Russia started running low, North Korea provided theirs. Those were a bit older because those were like stockpiles from the Cold War era, and some of those stockpiles were a little unreliable because for ammunition, it's not just the ammunition itself, but it's also the propellant, whether it be gunpowder for bullets or fuel for a missile or an artillery round. Some of that was corroded and degraded, so it was a little less reliable for targeting, but nonetheless, they were able to get a resupply. And for uniformed troops, North Korea initially denied that it sent troops, but after casualties started growing, then they acknowledged it. And another note, North Korean troops are not just combat troops, not just infantry on the ground. They have also sent engineer troops in order to do reconstruction and other efforts over for Russia in Kursk. For example, digging trenches, building fortifications, and so forth. There are unsubstantiated rumors that North Korean troops are in Sumy over in Ukraine, but however, again, it's unsubstantiated. We don't know. And also, civilian workers. There are North Korean factories right now that are acting as a supplemental manufacturing point, not to mention North Korean workers going to Russia working their factories. One big difference between North Korean workers there and other places, North Korea actually sent some workers over to South Korea in a special economic zone way back when South Korea wanted to offer an olive branch, so to speak, in terms of like future reunification or just trying to lessen tensions. They were paid very well over there. North Korean workers actually received chocolate pies, which were a South Korean candy, which instead of eating, they ended up taking them and reselling them on the illegal market back there. But however, for Russia, involuntary, far harsher conditions, probably big risk of safety with injuries or even death on a factory line if you don't have proper regulations in place to ensure that everyone is operating normally. Next slide. Kidnapped children. Since the Russian invasion of Ukraine, there have been Ukrainian children that have either gone missing, either due to capture by Russian troops or who fled, but however are still unaccounted for. Back in December 2025, Katerina Rakevka, she actually spoke in front of Congress to highlight this issue, and she has alleged that some Ukrainian children may be in North Korea. Songdo-won camp, it's a camp that's used by the North Korean elite. There are rumors and allegations that they are being brainwashed there for future use by Russia. The term janissaries, for those who are unfamiliar, the Ottoman Empire, the predecessor to Turkey, what they would do is, as an imperial power, after they conquered an area, they would take the children of those conquered regions, involuntarily draft them and train them to become troops. So this way, they will be loyal to Turkey, and they will be able to have additional people in order to fight. Again, that's an allegation that has been seriously brought up, and and has been going on, and has been a big issue during this unfortunate time of Russian invasion of Ukraine. Next slide. For the North Korean impact, they've taken a high number of casualties. We don't know the exact number, but however, it's most likely several thousand that are either dead, wounded, and a small number have been captured and are POWs. However, even though there are a significant number of North Korean casualties, the North Korean military has improved since the relations with Russia have improved as well. In a recent story, there were North Korean missile launchers that were on display. They were newer ones because previous North Korean missile launchers were from the Cold War era. Furthermore, there was a naval destroyer ship that North Korea unsuccessfully failed to launch. They failed to launch it due to a lot of engineering issues, but however, the fact that they were able to manufacture one, especially as a country that is under severe sanctions, is also of concern. And it's been going on for decades now. North Korea still has a nuclear weapons program. They still continue to test missiles. Right now, their ballistic missiles supposedly have been improving, both for sake of reliability and accuracy, because of Russian involvement. And prior to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, like I mentioned, North Korean troops, they didn't have much combat experience. They were primarily doing a lot of farming work or industrial work just because North Korea was so short-handed. However, they have gone to fight, and they have come back with experience, and there are rumors that some survivors have been teaching and updating the training for North Korean troops. Another caveat, drone warfare. Here in the West, drone warfare is at the operational and strategic level. Normally you have colonels and generals who are in control of it, and troops on the ground coordinate with their higher headquarters in order to use them. What's been going on for the Russian invasion of Ukraine, drones are being used at the tactical level by soldiers on the ground and by junior officers leading them. And North Korea has been gaining tactical experience with drones. And last but not least, cyber. Several years ago, there was a movie that came out called The Interview, in which Seth Rogen was interviewing Kim Jong-un as a comedy for fiction. North Korea launched a cyber attack to disrupt that movie because of the new relations with Russia. Right now, there's a good chance that their tactics and their technology have improved for the sake of cyber war. Next slide. As for South Korea, they have not been taking this lying down, but there are some caveats and concerns. First, for catch-up efforts. Back last year in 2025, South Korea allotted hundreds of millions of won, which is equal to several million of our dollars, in order to both develop its own drone warfare program and develop training for its troops. The caveat is, while they're getting some training, they're playing catch-up. It's still, again, training that has not been used in combat just yet, so it's still uncertain whether those tactics are going to be effective on a battlefield in real life, or whether they're going to need heavy modifications. And also, U.S. military personnel. We do still have several thousand troops over in South Korea, but the numbers are far smaller today compared to the Cold War. And furthermore, because of U.S. entanglements elsewhere, for example, Venezuela, Iran, Korea has become less of a priority. So even though there's training, even though they're still stationed there, it's been de-emphasized, which can be a concern because American troops in and of themselves are far smaller compared to the South Korean army. But however, we have tech, and we are supposed to be doing coordinative efforts along with other collaborative efforts. There are concerns about how effective we'll be based upon current times. And for escalation risks, for politically, South Korea, over the years, there have been a lot of times of tensions, but however, like I mentioned earlier, they opened special economic zones. They've tried to hold family reunions. They've tried to hold out olive branch reunification efforts with North Korea. However, as of late, it's been rendered moot just for the fact that, again, we've had a new leader in North Korea, and based upon the relationship with Russia, they've got more to gain by aligning themselves with Putin, and For them, reconciliation and reunification is a waste. And finally, economic considerations. South Korea did join the economic sanctions against Russia after the invasion of Ukraine. But however, similar to Taiwan, which I presented earlier, they still rely on Russian oil and Russian assets because they still need to have fuel in order to operate their cities, their military, and a lot of other important needs. And also, recent U.S. tariffs. Right now, tariffs, even though we as Americans are the ones who are paying for them, they nonetheless create tensions when you're trading with another country, and there's also causing just a lot of other ripple effects and causing a lot of other problems when you're trying to, again, establish trade and trustworthiness with someone else. Particularly, again, South Korea has its own defense industry. They do manufacture and even export their own equipment. But however, if there's ever going to be, let's say, any collaborative efforts or for that, or just for even civilian goods, tariffs now adversely affect that. And like I wanted to take a moment to describe to you earlier, when I showed you the picture of me at the DMZ, that's the building I'm talking about. If you look where the guard is at, this concrete area, that's the outside border between North and South Korea. And again, inside that building, that doorway is like a marker near that concrete barrier. Like I said, had I gone through that door, I would have been in North Korea. And I also heard from my tour guide that while there hasn't been any major violence for decades, North Korea still also conducts psychological warfare. For example, they will try to slip propaganda under the door into the building, or they may, sort of like as a frat or sorority style prank, they'll burst into the South Korean side, have their soldiers shine their shoes with a U.S. or South Korean flag. Again, it's still a divided country, and Russia's invasion of Ukraine is causing further divisions and is causing even worse adverse effects during these times. Next slide. Now, questions and answers. One more slide. All right. I know the majority of you, but however, I see a couple of new faces. I ask that you, for record and for me, please tell us your name and your background so I can best understand where you're coming from. You know about me. I'd like to know about you. Please keep your questions related to this presentation. Again, tonight we're talking about Korea and Russia. I want to keep it that way so this way I'm best able to answer your questions. And also, please don't interrupt someone else's turn or exceed your time. I want to ensure everybody has a chance to ask, and I want to make sure no one's hogging the floor. Again, I want to make sure everyone who wants to ask has a chance. Thank you. Go ahead. Okay, go ahead.
I hate to break the rule, but this question goes into North Korean geopolitics in relation to Russia and China.
Yes.
We've heard much about North Korean collaboration with the Russian Federation, the war with Ukraine, and even prior to that. But it is a popular idea that China has most of the control due to its closeness and its economic incentives over North Korea to control its geopolitics. China itself has held a neutral position towards the Russian invasion of Ukraine. North Korea has seemingly broke with this and gone towards avid, if not private, support, both in industry and military support. Do you think that the Chinese Communist Party and the ruling government there has supported this decision, or is this something that the North Koreans themselves, along with the blessing of the Russian Federation, do? And do you think that this could affect later Chinese decisions in relation to Russian losses and the possibility of a Russian loss, if not half victory, fear of victory in Ukraine?
Okay, to answer those two things. All right, first, China's relation with North Korea, as I mentioned on the slides, they do have relations, but however, China's relations with North Korea were secondary during the Cold War because during that time, the USSR was bigger in size and in economics, and there was also a rift because Mao Zedong and Kim Il-sung, they put up with each other, and even though there was some Chinese aid, China was thinking, especially during the Sino-Soviet split, come on, come on, come on, are you really supporting us if you're so cozy with Russia? China still supports North Korea today, and it greatly supported them like during the initial federation time. But it's not so much offensive, warm support; it's more of defensive support because for China,
One.
it's no the amount is nowhere near the level of the Soviet Union, and also number two, China is worried about North Korean collapse because if there's a North Korean collapse, they have to deal with a bunch of refugees flooding over the border into China, and they already have a small trickle right now. They don't want it to get worse. And to answer your part two question, for Russian losses, China mildly wants Russia to win, but however, it's again they're trying to play both sides because China still trades with Ukraine, and there's also the concern about if there is a loss again, are there going to be Russian refugees also coming over and so forth? I would say that, like I said, Xi and Putin are having very good terms compared to Mao and Brezhnev back in the day. But just to sum up it, China provides minor support even after the Soviet Union fell because again tensions from previous times, and again it was more of we want to keep North Korea from collapsing. We don't want to end up having to take on this burden after we just started developing our own economy because, like mentioned, Gorbachev pulled away from North Korea after he saw that it was declining and South Korea was growing. And again, if Russia loses, China would be upset, but I'm thinking they're partially hedging their bets, so it's more of wanting something, but they probably have an insurance policy, so to speak, if something else happens. Anyone else? Okay, first you and then you. All right, go ahead.
Are there sort of any deep into the lessons that North Korea is learning specifically from drone anti-drone warfare on the battlefield in Ukraine? And second question about China outlook at the deepening Russia-North Korea relationship. I hear a lot.
There's a microphone. Sorry.
I hear a lot that China experts saying that China is unhappy about this deepening relationship with Russia and North Korea. But my feeling as a Russia expert is that China, given its size, if it was really unhappy, it could have limited that relationship. So I would be interested in that. Thank you.
Okay. Again, another trilateral thing. But going back to your original point for drone warfare, based upon both researching a bunch of news articles and Defense Journal articles, along with talking with a Ukrainian soldier who was relaying experiences of his comrades on the ground, right now, a lot of those Ukrainian drones are heavily taking out North Korean soldiers. They did it in the beginning, especially because, again, there had been lack of familiarity. During this time, based upon what I've been hearing and reading, North Korea is slowly beginning to adapt to it because, for example, they're beginning to learn how to use cover and concealment more. They're beginning to learn how to again use multiple soldiers in terms of having a feint, such as having a drone concentrate on one while another soldier tries to take one out. They are still taking heavy losses, but however, I would say that they are growing. They are growing. It is getting rougher. It's still effective, but again, they are beginning to learn about fire and maneuver because dodging gunfire and dodging artillery is different than dodging a drone in terms of like how to move and how to again communicate with your comrades on the battlefield. And as for China and Russia, in terms of relations, just to rehash, China does not want North Korea to fall, but however, just similar to Gorbachev, they are not that warm towards North Korea because they've actually tried to convince North Korea, develop your economy a little more, because even though I was talking with a gentleman outside earlier, even though there are some some illegal markets where people are having side hustles in North Korea for money, however, it hasn't actually developed into like a semi-capitalist market like China, because that requires giving up some control and also exposure to the outside world. And just to rehash, China's been trying to pressure North Korea to do so. North Korea hasn't, and China again provides minor aid versus Russia's major aid because theirs are more strings attached because they don't want to get used like they were during the Cold War. Because again, sugar daddy diplomacy, North Korea was trying to get aid from both the mainland and from the USSR. Does that answer it? Thank you. And I think you were next.
Hello everyone, I'm Marcela. I'm a former lieutenant from Colombian Air Force.
Okay.
I have a company here in the United States to develop defense and distribution defense products in special for foreign military sales and
Yes.
DLA.
Yes.
And my question is, what is the real information about nuclear weapon development? Because more of, I think that 50% of the information could be a psychologist's operation. What is the real fact about that development?
Okay. When it comes down to nuclear weapons about North Korea, that one I'd have to probably do some research. I would say that it definitely exists because whenever you set off a nuclear weapon, it's almost like a small earthquake. It's not just like an artillery round which causes a little shaking on the ground. It sets off essentially on a Richter scale. There's also again radiation that normally comes from it. The exact details, I'm sorry, that one I do not know about. I would say though that the caveat with North Korean nuclear weapons, one, they have them, but we don't know how much they have because, again, because of sanctions, developing a nuclear weapon requires access to heavy metals like uranium, plutonium, and other things. And again, North Korea has it, but it's difficult to get in, even with good smuggling. And then also, like I mentioned earlier, ballistic missiles, they have them, but however, my thoughts are they're trying to save them in case they actually want to use them. It's more of protection of regime. They don't want what happened to East and West Germany to happen to them, because if that did happen, the Kim dynasty, they would probably be executed either by their own people or by others. And then I would also say, last and not least, for nuclear weapons, they're probably not going to use them against South Korea, because I read a theory by one analyst years ago. North Korea's attacking South Korea with a nuclear weapon, I'll use my language, it's shitting where you eat. If they are to launch a nuclear weapon, it would probably be either against either a naval formation, let's say in the water, just trying to get out a bunch of ships at once, or they'd be more interested against Japan based upon bad blood and the fact that, again, North Korea, if they ever were to try to invade again, they want South Korea intact. They don't want to dirty it up. Does that answer your questions?
Sure, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
You brought a very good point about Chinese investment in both the Russian Federation and in Ukraine. And first of all, I'd like to apologize. I didn't introduce myself to your question. My name is Yuri Kimiontek. I'm the American Director for the Anti-Imperial Bloc of Nations. The question moves again towards the point that North Korean military involvement in the armed conflict between Ukraine and Russia is not new. It had happened for the most part even before 2022 with Russian and North Korean military and infrastructure agreements. In your belief that China does not have as much sway over North Korea as you think, what do you think the North Korean government, this is a question, what do you think the North Korean government is seeking to gain out of Russia apart from financing by involving itself in this war against Ukraine and in part NATO?
Actually, good question, and I came across this in research. I didn't want to bring it up in the slides because, again, trying to keep it summarized. But it's also additional commercial goods because, for instance, along with a lot of military equipment, along with a lot of other things, I've also been reading that, again, North Korea has had a starvation problem and a famine due to a lot of their own bad practices combined with bad luck with bad weather conditions, natural disasters, and so forth. There have been rumors that North Korea has been trying to get Russian pork, trying to get Russian vodka, and that they're elite trying to get Russian caviar, because I would say that even though we're talking about seriousness about military, industrial, or espionage purposes, but for commercial purposes, the people of Pyongyang are living large. They're living like in Beverly Hills in the U.S. compared to, let's say, a slum over in Mississippi. I would say, again, commercial goods and just back and forth traffic, because it's a way to placate the people. And again, just having access means more money and goods flowing back and forth. And also, one more thing, so I can finish up my thought, barter, because while North Korea does have its own money, but however, Russia, from what I'm reading, they've actually been bartering with other countries in an attempt to circumvent sanctions, such as they traded chickpeas for tangerines with Pakistan. I'm going a little off topic, but again, if you can't trade, if you can't buy it, barter for it, trade for it. Again, I'm thinking, going back to point, Russia and North Korea might be bartering or trading if money is a problem. Thank you. You're welcome. Okay, you and then you. All right.
Okay. My name is Samar Chatterjee, Safe Foundation. Now, I was born in India, but I'm an American citizen.
Yes.
But when I grew up, the news of Panmunjom, where the Americans and the Russians met, they were the main negotiator, not North Korea and South Korea. They were minor, and even though on their territory they were fighting, but the control was in the hands of the United States on one side, and on the other side, the Russians and the Chinese came in. Of course, because the Russians asked them, hey, you fight on the ground, because we don't want to fight on the ground. We want logistics and air support. So given that, my question is, North Korea exists as a baby of Soviet Union
Yes.
and China.
Yes.
So given that, why would they want North Korea to? In fact, I'm glad that now North Korea is supporting Russia. If there were any difference, now Russia would support North Korea as much as the United States is supporting South Korea.
Okay.
So my position is that there should be no doubt that that the Russians and the Chinese will not be supporting North Korea.
You're absolutely right. North Korea and China, there is support. The support actually grew after the collapse of the Soviet Union, but just to re-clarify and re-emphasize, it was not a one-for-one replacement. China was still growing its economy, and also because of tensions and feeling like they were being, playing second fiddle during the Cold War, it was more of, we're keeping North Korea afloat. We're not going to give them all these like subsidized goods like the Soviet Union did because of that. And another point that you mentioned about North Korea, Russia, and China. Another issue why China is trying to support North Korea, a buffer state. Even though it talks with South Korea, relations have soured a little bit over the years, even though there's trade. And also, the U.S. military and other militaries still have foreign bases over in South Korea. Having North Korea, like I said, is a buffer because, as another example, as you saw on the slide that I showed you earlier about geography, Russia had Mongolia as a buffer state. Mongolia actually wanted to become an SSR in the Soviet Union. However, the Soviet Union said no, because by being semi-independent, by not being a formal SSR, it again serves as buffer without overly provoking or having to worry about governing or providing support. So again, China is still supporting North Korea, no doubt. But however, the Russian amount is far greater just because, again, of historical ties, and China is also making sure, what can we get out of this? Because as I mentioned, even though you have like a few small little merchants that are over in North Korea, there isn't true capitalism to where you can actually, let's say, not just have a small little stand, but let's say grow it into a bigger store or into a chain of stores like you can in a Western country. And China's actually tried to get North Korea to open up a little, liberalize its economy a little more. North Korea has said no, because they want to have control, and too much liberalization of a market might also mean even greater leaks of information, because even today there's bootleg Western media in North Korea, but it's still hard to get. They liberalize their markets. It'll get worse, but again, just to reemphasize, it exists. But however, there's the buffer zone, which is one reason why there's support. And there was one person after you. Yes, go ahead. You tell us your name and your background.
Hi, my name is Ian. I have a background in China research, but don't worry, I'm not going to ask you about China. So you mentioned that Korea is a very paternalistic society in your presentation. I'd like to know your thoughts about Kim Jong-un's daughter and the prospects of her taking over someday. And also, I know you mentioned this a little bit, but could you just give a big picture view of the military lessons that that North Korea is learning in its actions in Ukraine?
Okay.
Thanks.
All right. I watched, to be truthful, like I said, I watched several YouTube videos from others about Kim Ju-ae, Kim Jong-un's daughter. So to be truthful, I am citing Untold by Tony and a few others for sake of not plagiarizing. A few points. One, Kim Jong-un is still relatively young right now. Again, both his father and his grandfather ruled up until they were elderly, and it was only after death that they finally passed down the title. As for Kim Ju-ae, there are other, even though South Korea and some say he's been grooming her, the problem is getting respect over there is going to be an issue, because in Asian countries, for example, you said you're a China researcher. China has had female empresses before. Unfortunately, they've had very bad reputations, both from some bad circumstances that happened during the reign, but also some decisions that they made as leaders. I think North Korea would be the same way. Kim Ju-ae, another counter theory proposed by some of the YouTubers that I was watching, she's a deflection. She may be more of, girl dad status, just because you had some Western celebrities that sometimes like go out shopping in Hollywood, and they deliberately go out for times where the paparazzi is going to catch them to inadvertently or advertently, build up that reputation. There is that. And Untold by Tony and a few others also mentioned that Kim Jong-un might have some sons, either known or bastard, illegitimate, and secret, that he's trying to hide, because right now all the eyes are watching on him, and even though North Korea is still a hermit kingdom, they take security seriously. Kim Ju-ae, again, bringing her out, it may not just be grooming, it may be more of a distraction, it may be just be more for PR. And to answer your questions about lessons learned, the big issue, I am repeating myself, but it's good to know, but it's important to know, it's North Korea is learning, again, the tactical applications of drones. Because when I was talking with the Ukrainian junior officer one time, I also had a recent U.S. Army Cav scout who just graduated from his OSET, one unit station training, which is their basic training along with their intermediate training for tactics. He was telling me that even though they were learning call for fire, how to call for artillery, they still have not learned how to use drones at the junior level just yet. And they're still, again, experimenting with evasion tactics, or how to coordinate for drones, because when you're on the battlefield and using a drone, it's not just toss out the drone and kill the enemy. You have to have a security element. You have to have a spotter. It's like for launching a mortar. It's not just that one soldier that's dropping a mortar into that tube and launching it. There are other soldiers that are providing security. There are other soldiers that are helping to resupply. Getting to the point, North Korea is learning, again, if they have either Russian drones that they're manufacturing get sent to them, how can they use it against South Korea if they ever were to invade? But also, if they were to go back into into Ukraine, or if Ukraine tried to go back into Kursk, how can we use it as on an offensive level? And again, they were definitely in Kursk. They are rumored to be in Sumy, but however, I have to check to see if there's been any update from my sources, either news or defense journals, over any developments since then. Does that answer your questions?
Thank you.
You're welcome. And
Thank you. Last one, and this is focused on North Korea, and this builds off of your question. Do you believe that the North Korean military's actions and I would say almost the bite on the lip, right? The bloody nose that they've taken out of Ukraine and Kursk, has that shaken any internal political or military faith in the North Korean regime that could aid in some regime change in the near future? Thank you.
okay, to answer that, one, the ramifications from those deaths. After all those deaths that have been coming out, there have been I've been seeing some YouTube content creators who've been relaying a bunch of news reports. North Korea is actually, as part of their internal domestic PR, has actually given away like apartments and given away and done some like award ceremonies for families of soldiers who died in action. So for right now, it hasn't really shaken the faith. For them, it's more of it's it's their resolve. Hey, we are the strong nation. We are helping Russia. We are not the weaklings that others claim that we are. We are upholding Juche and Songun. But also, as for regime change in North Korea is probably going to be among the least likely of countries among different authoritarian nations, because, as I mentioned to you, some of those tall tales, it's not just that, there's this great leader, or not like just like Putin or Lukashenko, Putin doing judo throws or doing a ceremonial, hockey skating and so forth. There have been sort of like mythical aspects attached to it. And also, for regime changes and revolutions, it's not just disaffected people. You have to have resources, you have to have organization, you have to have charismatic leadership. The problem is right now, with the way North Korea is just so tightly controlled, and just because of the Kim legacy, it's just too difficult to mount a revolution, because a lot of the people who are the elites who are in Pyongyang, they don't want to rock the boat. They don't want to get sent to the countryside and lose their cushy house or access to bootleg goods and so forth. And the people in the countryside, they're too busy trying to keep themselves alive, trying to avoid starvation in order to do that. And a lot of the North Korean troops, it's just still too tightly controlled, because they are living just barely above what the average civilian peasant is. If you're a North Korean soldier, sure, you're getting a meal, but however you revolt, you're not getting that meal. So again, you have to answer that. Regime change is going to be difficult just because of the different circumstances that have been going on over in North Korea. You're welcome. And do I have any further questions? Well, if this is the case, I do want to say I appreciate all of you coming out here tonight. I'm glad I was able to present to you a bit of an update and a bit of a tie-in in terms of North Korea and Russia. And a lot of you, I'm very impressed with all of your knowledge. I'm hoping to have at least bolstered some of it or provided you some additional information. And hopefully we can have a proper resolution of the Ukrainian victory, even with, unfortunately, another horrible regime helping Russia during this war at this time. Thank you.